हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम देखेंगे एनसीईआरटी हिस्ट्री क्लास 12 का थीम 3 किंगशिप, कास्ट एंड क्लास, अर्ली सोसाइटीज 600 BCE टू 600 CE। तो शुरू करते हैं। In the previous chapter, we saw that there were several changes in economic and political life between 600 BCE and 600 CE. Some of these changes influence societies as well. For instance, the extension of agriculture into forested areas transformed the lives of forest dwellers. Craft specialists often emerged as distinct social groups. The unequal distribution of wealth sharpened social differences. Historians often use textual tradition to understand these processes. Some texts lay down norms of social behavior, others describe the occasionally comment on a wide range of social situations and practices. We can also catch a glimpse of some social actors from inscriptions. As we will see, each text and inscription was written from the perspective of specific social category, so we need to keep in mind who composed what and for whom. We also need to consider the language used and the ways in which the text circulated. Used carefully, text allow us to piece together attitudes and practices that shaped social histories. In focusing on the Mahabharata, a colossal epic running in its present form into over 100,000 verses with depiction of a wide range of social categories and situations, we draw on one of the richest texts of the subcontinent. It was composed of over a period of about 1000 years, uh, 500 BC onwards, and some of the stories its content may have been in circulation even earlier. The central story is about two sets of warring cousins. The text also contains sections laying down norms of behavior for various social groups. Occasionally, though not always, the principal characters seem to follow these norms. What does conformity with norms and deviation from them signify? The critical edition of the Mahabharata. One of the most ambitious projects of the scholarship began in 1919 under the leadership of a noted Indian Sanskritist V.S. Sukantakar. A team a team comprising dozens of scholars initiated the task of preparing a critical edition of the Mahabharata. What exactly did this involve? Initially, it meant collecting Sanskrit manuscripts of the text written in a variety of scripts from different parts of the country. The team worked out a method of comparing verses from each manuscript. Ultimately, they selected the verses that appeared common to the most versions and published these in several volumes, running into over 13,000 pages. The project took 47 years to complete. Two things became apparent. There are several common elements in the Sanskrit versions of the story. Evident in manuscripts found all over the subcontinent, from Kashmir and Nepal in the north to Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the south. Also evident were enormous regional variations in the way in which the text had been transmitted over the centuries. This variation was documented in footnotes and appendices to the main text. Taken together, more than half the 13,000 pages are devoted to these variations. In a sense, these variations are reflective of the complex processes that shaped early and later social histories. Through dialogues between dominant tradition and resilient local ideas and practices, these dialogues are characterized by moments of conflict as well as consensus. Our understanding of these processes is derived primarily from texts written in Sanskrit by and for Brahmanas. When issues of social history were explored for the first time by historians in the 19th and 20th century that tended to take this text at face value, believing that everything that was laid down in this text was actually practiced. Subsequently, scholars began studying other traditions from works in Pali, Prakrit, and Tamil. These studies indicated that the ideas contained in normative Sanskrit texts were on the whole recognized as authoritative. They were also questioned and occasionally even rejected. It is important to keep this in mind as we examine how historians reconstruct social histories. Kinship and marriage, many rules and varied practices. Terms for family and kin. Sanskrit texts use the term kula to designate families and najanti for the largest network of kinfolk. The term vamsa is used for lineage. Finding out about families. We often take family life for granted. However, you may have noticed that not all families are identical. They vary in terms of numbers of members, their relationship with one another, as well as the kinds of activities they share. Often, people belonging to the same family share food and other resources and live, work, and perform rituals together. Families are usually part of larger networks of people defined as relatives, or to use a more technical term, kinfolk. While familial ties are often regarded as natural and based on blood, they are defined in many different ways. For instance, some societies regard cousin as being blood relations, whereas others do not. For early societies, historians can retrieve information about allied families fairly easily. It is, however, far more difficult to reconstruct the familial relationship of ordinary people. Historians also investigate and analyze attitudes towards family and kinships. These are important because they provide an insight into people's thinking. It is likely that some of these ideas would have shaped their actions, just as actions may have led to changes in attitudes. The ideal of paternity. Can we identify points when kinship relations changed? At one level, the Mahabharata is a story about this. It describes a feud over land and power between two groups of cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, who belonged to a single ruling family, that of the Kurus, a lineage dominating one of the Janapadas. Ultimately, the conflict ended in a battle in which the Pandavas emerged victorious. After that, patrilineal succession was proclaimed. While paternity has existed prior to the composition of the epic, the central story of the Mahabharata reinforced the idea that it was valuable. Under patrilineal, sons could claim the resources, including the throne in the case of kings, of their father when the latter died. Patrilineal means tracing descent from father to son, grandson, and so on. Matrilineal is the term used when the descent is traced through the mother. Most ruling dynasties 6th century BCE onwards claimed to follow this system, although there were variations in practices. Sometimes there were no sons. In some situations, brothers succeeded one another. Sometimes other kinsmen claimed the throne, and in very exceptional circumstances, women such as Prabhavati Gupta exercised powers. The concern with paternity was not unique to ruling families. It is evident in mantras in ritual texts such as the Rig Veda. It is possible that these attitudes were shared by wealthy men and those who claimed high status, including Brahmanas. Producing fine sons. Here is an excerpt of a mantra from the Rig Veda, which was probably inserted in the text 1000 BCE to be chanted by the priest while conducting the marriage ritual. It is used in many Hindu weddings even today. I free her from here, but not from there. I have bound her firmly there, so that through the grace of Indra she will have fine sons and be fortunate in her husband's love. Indra was one of the principal deities, a god of valor, warfare, and rain. Here and there refer to the father's and husband's house respectively. Why kinfolk quarreled? This is an excerpt from the Adi Parvan literally the first section of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, describing why conflicts arose among the Kauravas and Pandavas. The Kauravas were the son of Dhritarashtra and the Pandavas were their cousins. Since Dhritarashtra was blind, his younger brother Pandu ascended the throne of Hastinapura. However, after the premature death of Pandu, Dhritarashtra became king, as the royal princes were still very young. As the princes grew up together, the citizens of Hastinapura began to express their preference for the Pandavas, for they were more capable and virtuous than the Kauravas. This made Duryodhana, the eldest of the Kauravas, jealous. He approached his father and said, "You yourself did not receive the throne, although it fell to you because of your defect. If the Pandava receive the patrimony from Pandu, his son will surely inherit it in turn, and so will his son and his. We ourselves with our son shall be excluded from the royal succession and become of slight regard in the eyes of the world, Lord of the earth." Passages such as these may not have been literally true, but they give us an idea about what those who wrote the text thought. Sometimes, as in the case, they contain conflicting ideas. Rules of marriages. While sons were important for the continuity of the patrilineage, daughters were viewed rather differently within this framework. They had no claims to the resources of the household. At the same time, marrying them into families outside the kin was considered desirable. This system was called exogamy, literally marrying outside, meaning that the lives of the young girls and women belonging to the families that claimed high status were often carefully regulated to ensure that they were married at the right time and to the right person. This gave rise to the belief that Kanyadana, or the gift of a daughter in marriage, was an important religious duty of the father. Types of marriages. Endogamy refers to a marriage within a unit. This could be a kin group, caste, or a group living in the same locality. Exogamy refers to a marriage outside the unit. Polygyny is the practice of a man having several wives. Polyandry is the practice of a woman having several husbands. With the emergence of new towns, social life became more complex. People from near and far met to buy and sell their products and share ideas in the urban milieu. This may have led to a questioning of earlier beliefs and practices. Faced with these challenges, the Brahmanas responded by laying down codes of social behavior in great detail. These were meant to be followed by Brahmanas in particular and the rest of the society in general. From 500 CE BCE, these norms were compiled in Sanskrit texts known as the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. The most important of such works, the Manusmriti, was compiled between 200 BCE and 200 CE. While the Brahmana authors of these texts claimed that their point of view had universal validity and that was what they prescribed had to be obeyed by everybody, it is likely that the real social relations were more complicated. Besides, given the regional diversity within the subcontinent and the difficulties of communication, the influence of Brahmanas was by no means all pervasive. What is interesting is that the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastra recognized as many as 8 forms of marriage. Of these, the first 4 were considered as good, while the remaining were condemned. It is possible that these were practiced by those who did not accept Brahmanical norms. 8 forms of marriage. Here are the first, 4th, 5th, and 6th forms of marriage from Manusmriti. First, the gift of a daughter after dressing her in costly clothes and honoring her with presents of jewels to a man learned in Veda, whom the father himself invites. Fourth, the gift of a daughter by the father after he has addressed the couple with the text, "May both of you perform your duties together," and has shown honor to the bridegroom. Fifth, when the bridegroom receives a maiden after having given as much wealth as he can afford to the kinsman and to the bride herself according to his own will. Sixth, the voluntary union of a maiden and her lover who springs from desire. The Gotra of women. One Brahmanical practice evident from 1000 BCE onwards was to classify people, especially Brahmanas, in terms of gotras. Each gotra was named after a Vedic seer, and all those who belonged to the same gotra were regarded as his descendants. Two rules about Gotra were particularly important. Women were expected to give up their father's Gotra and adopt that of their husband on marriage, and members of the same Gotra could not marry. One way to find out whether this was commonly followed is to consider the names of men and women, which were sometimes derived from Gotra names. These names were available for powerful ruling lineages such as the Satyavahanas, who ruled over the parts of western India and the Deccan, 2nd century BCE to 2nd century CE. Several of their inscriptions have been recovered, which allow historians to trace family ties including marriages. Names of Satyavahana kings from inscription. These are the names of several generations of Satyavahana rulers recovered from inscription. Note the uniform title Raja. Also note the following word which ends with the term Puta, a Prakrit word meaning son. The term Gotami Puta means son of Gotami. Names like Gotami Vasishthi are feminine forms of Gotama and Vasishtha, Vedic seers after whom Gotras were named. राजा गौतमी पुत्र सिरी शतकानी, राजा वशिष्ठी पुत्र स्वामी सिरी पुलुमाई, राजा गौतमी पुत्र स्वामी सिरी याना शतकानी, राजा मधारी पुत्र सभिसकासेना, राजा वशस्ती पुत्र चतुरपाणा शतकानी, राजा हरिति पुत्र विन्हुकादा चुटुकुलादा शतकामनी, राजा गौतमी पुत्र सिरी विजया शतकानी. Metronomics in the Upanishad. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the earliest Upanishads, contains a list of successive generations of teachers and students, many of whom were designated by metronymics. Some of the Satyavahana rulers were polygynous, that is, had more than one wife. An examination of the names of women who married Satyavahana rulers indicates that many of them had names derived from Gotras such as Gotama and Vasishtha, their fathers' Gotras. They evidently retained this name instead of adopting names derived from their husband's Gotra name, as they were required to do according to the Brahminical rules. What is also apparent is that some of these women belong to the same Gotra, as is obvious. This ran counter to the ideal of exogamy recommended in the Brahmanical text. In fact, it exemplified an alternative practice, that of endogamy or marriage within the kin group, which was and is prevalent among several communities in South India. Such marriages amongst kinfolk, such as cousins, ensured a close-knit community. It is likely that there were variations in other parts of the subcontinent as well, but as yet it has not been possible to reconstruct specific details. A mother's advice. The Mahabharata describes how, when war between the Kauravas and the Pandavas became almost inevitable, Gandhari made one last appeal to her eldest son Duryodhana. By making peace, you honor your father and me as well as your well wishes. It is the wise man in control of his senses who guards his kingdom. Greed and anger drag a man away from his profits. By defeating these two enemies, a king conquers the earth. You will happily enjoy the earth, my son, along with the wise and heroic Pandavas. There is no good in a war, no law, dharma, and profit author, let alone happiness, nor is there necessarily victory in the end. Don't set your mind on war. Duryodhana did not listen to this advice and fought and lost the war. Were mothers important? We have seen that Satyavahana rulers were identified through metronymics, name derived from that of the mother. Although this may suggest that mothers were important, we need to be cautious before we arrive at any conclusion. In the case of the Satyavahanas, we know that succession to the throne was generally patrilineal. Social differences within and beyond the framework of caste. You are probably familiar with the term caste, which refers to a set of hierarchical ordered social categories. The ideal order was laid down in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. Brahmanas claimed that this order, in which they were ranked first, was divinely ordained, while placing groups classified as Sudras and untouchables at the very bottom of the social order. Position within the order were supposedly determined by birth. The right occupation. The Dharma Sutra and Dharma Shastras also contain rules about the ideal occupations of the four categories or varnas. Brahmanas were supposed to study and teach the Vedas, perform sacrifices and get sacrifices performed, and give and receive gifts. Kshatriyas were to engage in warfare, protect people, and administer justice. Study the Vedas, get sacrifices performed, and make gifts. The last three occupations were also assigned the Vaisyas, who were in addition expected to engage in agriculture, pastoralism, and trade. Sudras were assigned only one occupation, that of serving the three higher varnas. The Brahmanas evolved two or three strategies for enforcing these norms. One, as we have just seen, was to assert that the Varna order was of divine origin. Second, they advised kings to ensure that these norms were followed within their kingdom. And third, they attempted to persuade people that their status was determined by birth. However, this was not always easy, so prescriptions were often reinforced by stories told in Mahabharata and other texts. A divine order. To justify their claims, Brahmanas often cited a verse from a hymn in the Rig Veda known as the Purusha Sukta, describing the sacrifice of Purusha, the primeval man. All the elements of the universe, including the four social categories, were supposed to have emanated from his body. The Brahmana was his mouth, of his arms, and was made of the Kshatriya. His thighs became the Vaisyas, of his feet the Sudra was born. Proper social roles. Here is a story from the Adi Parvana of the Mahabharata. Once Drona, a Brahmana who taught archery to the Kuru princess, was approached by Eklavya, a forest-dwelling Nisada, a hunting community. When Drona, who knew the Dharma, refused to have him as his pupil, Eklavya returned to the forest, prepared an image of Drona out of clay, and treating it as his teacher, began to practice on his own. In due course, he acquired great skills in archery. One day, the Kuru princess went hunting, and their dog, wandering in the woods, came upon Eklavya. When the dog smelt the dark Nisada wrapped in black deer skin, his body caked with dirt, it began to bark. Annoyed, Eklavya shot 7 arrows into his mouth. When the dog returned to the Pandavas, they were amazed at the superb display of archery. They tracked down Eklavya, who introduced himself as a pupil of Drona. Drona had once told his favorite student Arjuna that he would be unrivaled amongst his pupils. Arjuna now reminded Drona about this. Drona approached Eklavya, who immediately acknowledged and honored him as a teacher. When Drona demanded his right thumb as his fee, Eklavya unhesitatingly cut it off and offered it. But thereafter, when he shot with his remaining fingers, he was no longer as fast as he had been before. Thus, Drona kept his word. No one was better than Arjuna. Non-Kshatriya kings. According to the Shastras, only Kshatriyas could be kings. However, several important ruling lineages probably had different origins. The social backgrounds of the Mauryas, who ruled over a large empire, has been hotly debated. While later Buddhist texts suggested they were Kshatriyas, Brahmanical texts describe them as being of low origin. The Sungas and Kanvas, the immediate successor of the Mauryas, were Brahmanas. In fact, political power was effectively open to anyone who could muster support and resources, and rarely depended on birth as a Kshatriya. Other rulers, such as the Sakas, who came from Central Asia, were regarded as mlechas, barbarians or outsiders, by the Brahmanas. However, one of the earliest inscriptions in Sanskrit describes the Rudradamana, the best known Saka ruler, rebuilt Sudarsana Lake. This suggests that powerful mlechas were familiar with Sanskritic traditions. It is also interesting that the best known ruler of the Satyavahana dynasty, Gautamiputra Sri Satakani, claimed to be both a unique Brahmana, Ekka Brahmana, and a destroyer of the pride of Kshatriyas. He also claimed to have ensured that there was no intermarriage amongst members of the four Varnas. At the same time, he entered into a marriage alliance with the king of Rudradamana. As you can see this example, integration within the framework of caste was often a complicated process. The Satyavahanas claimed to be Brahmana, whereas according to the Brahmanas, kings ought to have been Kshatriyas. They claimed to uphold the fourfold Varna order but entered into marriage alliance with people who were supposed to be excluded from the system. And as we have seen, they practiced endogamy instead of exogamous system recommended in the Brahmanical text. Jatis and social mobility. These complexities are reflected in another term used in text to refer to social categories, jati. In Brahmanical theory, jati like varna was based on birth. However, while the number of varnas was fixed at 4, there was no restriction on the number of jatis. In fact, whenever Brahmanical authorities encounter new group, for instance, people living in forests such as Nisardas, or wanted to assign a name to occupational categories such as the goldsmith or Swarnakara, which did not easily fit into the fourfold Varna system, they classified them as a jati. Jatis which shared a common occupation or profession were sometimes organized into srenis or guilds. We seldom come across documents that record the histories of these groups, but there are exceptions. One interesting stone inscription, 5th century CE, found in Mandsaur, Madhya Pradesh, records the history of a guild of silk weavers who originally lived in Lata, Gujarat, from where they migrated to Mandsaur, then known as Dasapura. It states that they undertook the difficult journey along with their children and kinfolk as they had heard about the greatness of the local king and wanted to settle in his kingdom. The inscription provides a fascinating glimpse of complex social processes and provides insight into the nature of guilds or srenis. Although membership was based on a shared craft specialization, some members adopted other occupations. It also indicates that the members had more than a common profession. They collectively decided to invest their wealth earned through the craft to construct a splendid temple in the honor of the sun god. The case of the merchants. Sanskrit text and inscription use the term vanik to designate merchants. While trade was defined as an occupation for Vaishyas in the Shastras, a more complex situation is evident in plays such as the Mnichikatika, written by Sudraka. Here, the hero Charudatta was described as both a Brahmana and a Satavaha or merchant, and a 5th century inscription describes two brothers who made a donation for the construction of a temple as Kshatriya Vaniks. What the silk weavers did. Here is an excerpt from the inscription which in Sanskrit. Some are intensely attached to music, so pleasing to the ear, others, being proud of the authorship of 100 excellent biographies, are conversant with wonderful tales. Others, filled with humility, are absorbed in excellent religious discourse. Some excel in their own religious rites. Likewise, by others who were self-possessed, the science of Vedic astronomy was mastered, and others, valors in battles, even today possibly cause harm to the enemies. Beyond the four oneness, integration. Given the diversity of the subcontinent, there were and always have been populations whose social practices were not influenced by Brahminical ideas. When they figure in Sanskrit texts, they are often described as odd, uncivilized, or even animal like. In some instances, these include forest dwellers for whom hunting and gathering remained an important means of subsistence. Categories such as the Nisada, to which Ekalavya is supposed to have belonged, are examples of this. Others who were viewed with suspicion included populations such as nomadic pastoralists who could not be easily accommodated within the framework of settled agriculturists. Sometimes those who spoke non-Sanskritic languages were labeled as lectures and looked down upon. There was nonetheless also sharing of ideas and beliefs between these people. The nature of relations is evident in some stories in the Mahabharata. A tiger like husband. This is the summary of a story from Adi Parvana of the Mahabharata. The Pandavas had fled into the forest. They were tired and fell asleep. Only Bhima, the second Pandava, renowned for his prowess, was keeping watch. A man-eating Rakshasa caught the scent of the Pandavas and sent his sister Hidimba to capture them. She fell in love with Bhima, transformed herself into a lovely maiden, and proposed to him. He refused. Meanwhile, the Rakshasa arrived and challenged Bhima to a wrestling match. Bhima accepted the challenge and killed him. The others woke up hearing the noise. Hidimba introduced herself and declared her love for Bhima. She told Kunti, I have forsaken my friends, my dharma, and my kin, and good lady, chosen your tiger like son for my man. Whether you think me a fool or your devoted servant, let me join you, great lady, with your son as my husband. Ultimately, Yudhishthira agreed to the marriage on the condition that they would spend the day together, but that Bhima would return every night. The couple roamed all over the world during the day. In due course, Hidimba gave birth to a Rakshasa boy named Ghatotkacha. Then the mother and son left the Pandavas. Ghatotkacha promised to return to the Pandavas whenever they needed them. Some historians suggest that the term Rakshasa is used to describe people whose practices differ from those laid down in Brahminical texts. Beyond the four varnas, subordination and conflict. While the Brahmanas considered some people as being outside the system, they also developed a sharper social divide by classifying certain social categories as untouchable. This rested on a notion that certain activities, especially those connected with the performance of rituals, were sacred and by extension pure. Those who considered themselves pure avoided taking food from those they designated as untouchable. In sharp, in sharp contrast to the purity aspect, some activities were regarded as particularly polluting. This included handling corpses and dead animals. Those who performed such tasks, designated as chandalas, were placed at very bottom of the hierarchy. Their touch and in some cases even seeing them was regarded as polluting by those who claimed to be at the top of the social order. The Manusmriti laid down the duties of the Chandalas. They had to live outside the village, use discarded utensils, and wear clothes of the dead and ornaments of iron. They could not walk about in villages and cities at night. They had to dispose of the bodies of those who had no relatives and serve as executioners. Much later, the Chinese Buddhist monk Fa Jian, 5th century CE, wrote that untouchable had to sound a clapper in the streets so that people could avoid seeing them. Another Chinese pilgrim, Yuan Zhang, 7th century, observed that executioners and scavengers were forced to live outside the city. By examining non-Brahminical texts which depict the lives of Chandalas, historians have tried to find out whether Chandalas accepted the life of degradation prescribed in the Shastras. Sometimes these depictions correspond with those in the Brahminical text, but occasionally there are hints of different social realities. The Bodhisattva as a Chandala. Did Chandalas resist the attempts to push them to the bottom of the social order? Read this story, which is a part of the Matanga Jataka, a Pali text where the Bodhisattva, the Buddha, in a previous word, is identified as a Chandala. Once the Bodhisattva was born outside the city of Banaras as a Chandala's son and named Matanga. One day, when he had gone to the city on some work, he encountered Dhita Mangalika, the daughter of a merchant. When she saw him, she exclaimed, "I have seen something inauspicious," and washed her eyes. The angry hanger-ons then beat him up. In protest, he went and lay down at the door of her father's house. On the seventh day, they brought out the girl and gave her to him. She carried the starving Matanga back to the Chandala settlement. Once he returned home, he decided to renounce the world. After attaining spiritual powers, he returned to Banaras and married her. A son named Mandavya Kumara was born to them. He learned the three Vedas as he grew up and began to provide food to 16,000 Brahmanas every day. One day, Matanga, dressed in rags, with a clay alms bowl in his hand, arrived at his son's doorstep and begged for food. Mandavya replied that he looked like an outcast and was unworthy of alms. The food was meant for the Brahmanas. Matanga said that those who are proud of their birth and are ignorant do not deserve gifts. On the contrary, those who are free from vices are worthy of offerings. Mandavya lost his temper and asked his servants to throw the men out. Matanga rose in the air and disappeared. When Dhita Mangalika learned about the incident, she followed Matanga and begged his forgiveness. He asked her to take a bit of the leftover from his bowl and give it to Mandavya and the Brahmanas. Beyond birth, resources, and status. If you recall economic relations discussed in chapter 2, you will realize that slaves, landless agriculture laborers, hunters, fisherfolk, pastoralists, peasants, village headmen, craftspersons, merchants, and kings emerged as social actors in different parts of the subcontinent. Their social positions were often shaped by their access to economic resources. Here we will examine the social implications of access to resources in certain specific situations. Gendered access to property. Consider first a critical episode in the Mahabharata during the course of the long-drawn rivalry between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Duryodhana invited Yudhishthira to a game of dice. The latter, who was deceived by his rival, staked his gold, elephants, chariots, slaves, army, treasury, kingdom, the property of his subjects, his brothers, and finally himself, and lost all. Then he staked their common wife Draupadi and lost her too. Issues of ownership foregrounded in stories such as this one also figure in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. According to Manusmriti, the paternal estate was to be divided equally among sons after the death of the parents with a special share for the eldest. Women could not claim a share of these resources. However, women were allowed to return the gifts they received on the occasion of their marriage as Tridhana, literally a woman's wealth. This could be inherited by the children without the husband having any claim on it. At the same time, the Manusmriti warned women against hoarding family property or even their own valuables without the husband's permission. You have read about wealthy women such as the Vakataka queen Prabhavati Gupta. However, cumulative evidence, both epigraphic and textual, suggests that while upper class women may have had access to resources, land, cattle, and money were generally controlled by men. In other words, social differences between men and women were sharpened because of the differences in access to resources. Draupadi's question. Draupadi is supposed to have asked Yudhishthira whether he had lost himself before taking her. Two contrary opinions were expressed in response to this question. One, that even if Yudhishthira had lost himself earlier, his wife remained under his control, so he could stake her. Two, that an unfree man as Yudhishthira was when he had lost himself could not stake another person. The matter remained unresolved. Ultimately, Dhritarashtra restored to the Pandavas and Draupadi their personal freedom. How could man and woman acquire wealth? For man, the Manusmriti declares there are 7 means of acquiring wealth: inheritance, finding, purchase, conquest, investment, work, and acceptance of gifts from good people. For women, there are 6 means of acquiring wealth: what was given in front of the fire, marriage, or the bridal procession, or as a token of affection, and what she got from her brother, mother, or father. She could also acquire wealth through any subsequent gift and whatever her affectionate husband might give her. Varna and access to properties. According to the Brahmanical text, another criterion apart from gender for regulating access to wealth was Varna. As we saw earlier, the only occupation prescribed for Sudras was servitude, while a variety of occupations were listed for men of the first 3 Varnas. If these provisions were actually implemented, the wealthiest men would have been the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas. That this corresponded to some extent with social realities is evident from description of priests and kings in other textual traditions. Kings are almost invariably depicted as wealthy. Priests are also generally shown to be rich, though there are occasional depictions of the poor Brahmana. At another level, even as the Brahmanical view of the society was codified in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras, other traditions developed critiques of the Varna order. Some of the best known of these were developed within early Buddhism. The Buddhists recognized that there were differences in society but did not regard this as natural or inflexible. They also rejected the idea of claims to status on the basis of birth. The Wealthy Sudra. The story, based on a Buddhist text in Pali known as the Majjhima Nikaya, is a part of dialogue between a king named Avantiputta and a disciple of the Buddha named Kachachana. While it may not be literally true, it reveals Buddhist attitudes towards Varna. Avantiputta asked Kachachana what he thought about Brahmanas who held that they were the best caste and that all other castes were low, that Brahmanas were a fair caste while all other castes were dark, that only Brahmanas were pure, not non-Brahmanas, that Brahmanas were son of Brahma, one born of his mouth, born of Brahma, formed by Brahma, heirs to Brahma. Kachajana replied, what if a Sudra were wealthy? Would another Sudra or a Kshatriya or a Brahmana or a Vaisya speak politely to him? Avantiputta replied that if a Sudra had wealth or corn or gold or silver. He could have as his obedient servant another Sudra to get up earlier than he, to go to rest later, to carry out his orders, to speak politely, or he could even have a Kshatriya or a Brahmana or a Vaisya as his obedient servant. Kachajana asked, this being so, are not these four varnas exactly the same? Avandiputta considered that there was no difference among the varnas on this count. An alternative social scenario, sharing wealth. So far we have been examining situations where people either claimed or were assigned status on the basis of their wealth. However, there were other possibilities as well. Situations where men who were generous were respected, while those who were miserly or simply accumulated wealth for themselves were despised. One area where these values were cherished was ancient Tamilakam, where, as we saw earlier, there were several chiefdoms around 2000 years ago. Amongst other things, the chiefs were patrons of the bards and poets who sang their praise. Poems included in Tamil Sangam anthologies often illuminate social and economic relationships, suggesting that while there were differences between rich and poor, those who controlled resources were also expected to share them. The poor generous chief. In this composition from the Puranaru, one of the anthologies of poems of the Tamil Sangam literature, a bard describes his patron to other poets thus: he, that means the patron, does not have the wealth to lavish on others every day, nor does he have the pettiness to say that he has nothing and so refuse. He lives in Entai, a place, and is generous. He is an enemy to the hunger of birds. If you wish to cure your poverty, come along with me, birds, whose lips are so skilled. If we request him, showing him our ribs thin with hunger, he will go to the blacksmith of his village and will say to that man of powerful hands, shape me a long spear for war, one that has a straight blade. Explaining social differences, a social contract. The Buddhists also developed an alternative understanding of social inequalities and of the institution required to regulate social conflict. In a myth found in a text known as the Sutta Pitaka, they suggested that originally human beings did not have fully evolved bodily forms, nor was the world of plants fully developed. All beings lived in an idyllic state of peace, taking from nature only what they needed for each meal. However, there was a gradual deterioration of this state as human beings became increasingly greedy, vindictive, and deceitful. This led them to wonder, what if we were to select a certain being who should be wrathful when indignation is right? Who should censor what that which should rightly be censored, and should banish him who deserves to be banished? Will give him in return a proportion of the rice chosen by the whole people. He will be known as Mahasamata, the great elect. This suggests that the institutions of kingship was based on human choice, with taxes as a form of payment for services rendered by the king. At the same time, it reveals recognition of human agency in creating and institutionalizing economic and social relations. There are other implications as well. For instance, if human beings were responsible for the creation of the system, they could also change it in future. Handling text. Historians and the Mahabharata. If you look through the sources cited in this chapter once more, you will notice that the historians consider several elements when they analyze text. They examine whether texts were written in Prakrit, Pali, or Tamil languages that were probably used by ordinary people, or in Sanskrit, a language made almost exclusively for priests and elites. They also consider the kinds of text where these mantras learned and chanted by ritual specialists, or stories that had people could have read or heard and then retold if they found them interesting. Besides, they try to find out whether the authors whose perspectives and ideas shaped the text, as well as the intended audience, as very often authors keep the interest of their audience in mind while composing their work. And they try and ascertain the possible date of the composition or compilation of the text, as well as the place where they may have been composed. It is only after making these assessments that they draw on the content of text to arrive at an understanding of their historical significance. As you can imagine, this is particularly difficult task for a text as complex as the Mahabharata. Language and content. Let us look at the language of the text. The version of the Mahabharata we have been considering is in Sanskrit, although there are versions in other languages as well. However, the Sanskrit used in the Mahabharata is far simpler than that of Vedas or of the Prahastis discussed in chapter 2. As such, it was probably widely understood. Historians usually classify the contents of the present text under two broad heads: sections that contain stories designated as the narrative, and sections that contain perceptions about social norms designated as didactic. This division is by no means watertight. The didactic sections include stories, and the narrative often contains a social message. However, generally, historians agree that the Mahabharata was meant to be a dramatic, moving story, and that the didactic portions were probably added later. Didactic refers to something that is meant for purposes of instructions. Interestingly, the text is described as an itihasa within early Sanskrit traditions. The literal meaning of the term is thus it was, which is why it is generally translated as history. Was there a real war that was remembered in the epic? We are not sure. Some historians think that the memory of an actual conflict amongst kinfolk was preserved in the narrative. Others point out that there is no other corroborative evidence of the battle. Authors and dates. Who wrote the text? This is a question to which there are several answers. The original story was probably composed by charioteer birds known as suitors, who generally accompanied warriors to the battlefield and composed poems celebrating their victories and other achievements. These compositions circulated orally, then from the 5th century BCE, Brahmanas took over the story and began to commit it to writing. This was the time when chiefdoms such as those of the Kurus and Panchalas, around whom the story of the epic revolves, were gradually becoming kingdoms. Did the new kings want their Itihasa to be recorded and preserved more systematically? It is also possible that the upheavals that often accompanied the establishment of these states, where old social values were often replaced by new norms, are reflected in some parts of the story. We noticed another phase in the composition of the text between 200 BCE and 200 CE. This was the period when the worship of Vishnu was growing in importance and Krishna, one of the important figures of the epic, was coming to be identified with Vishnu. Subsequently, between 200 and 400 CE, large didactic sections resembling the Manusmriti were added. With these additions, a text which initially perhaps had less than 10,000 verses grew to comprise about 100,000 verses. This enormous composition is traditionally attributed to a sage named Vyasa. The search for convergence. The Mahabharata, like any major epic, contains vivid descriptions of battles, forests, palaces, and settlements. In 1951 to 52, the archaeologist B.B. Lal excavated at a village named Hastinapur in Meerut, Uttar Pradesh. Was this the Hastinapur of the epic? While the similarity in the names could be coincidental, the location of the site in the upper Ganga Doab, where the Kuru kingdom was situated, suggests that it may have been the capital of the Kurus mentioned in the text. Lal found evidence of the 5 occupational levels, of which the second and the third are of interest to us. This is what Lal noted about the houses in the second phase, 12th to 7th century BC. Within the limited area excavated, no definite plans of houses were obtained, but walls of mud and mud bricks were duly encountered. The discovery of mud plaster with prominent reed marks suggested that some of the houses had reed walls plastered plastered over with mud. For the third phase, he noted houses of this period were built of mud brick as well as burnt bricks. Soakage jars and brick drains were used for drainage out refuse water, while terracotta ring wells may have been used both as well and drainage pits. Was the description of the city in the epic added after the main narrative had been composed? When, after the 6th century BCE, urban centers flourished in the region, or was it a flight of poetic fancy which cannot always be verified by comparison with other kind of evidence? Consider another instance. One of the most challenging episodes in the Mahabharata is Draupadi's marriage with the Pandavas, an instance of polyandry that is central to the narrative. If we examine the section of the epic that describes this event, it is evident that the authors attempted to explain it in a variety of ways. Hastinapur. This is how the city is described in Adi Parvana of the Mahabharata. The city bursting like the ocean, packed with hundreds of mansions, displayed with its gateways, arcades, and turrets like massing clouds, the splendor of the great Indra city. Draupadi's marriage. Draupadi, Draupadi, the king of Panchala, organized a competition where the challenge was to string a bow and hit a target. The winner would be chosen to marry his daughter Draupadi. Arjuna was victorious and was garlanded by Draupadi. The Pandavas returned with her to their mother Kunti, who even before she saw them asked them to share whatever they had got. She realized her mistake when she saw Draupadi, but her command could not be violated. After much deliberation, Yudhishthira decided that Draupadi would be their common wife. When Draupadi was told about this, he protested. However, the Sri Vyasa arrived and told him that the Pandavas were in reality incarnations of Indra, whose wife had been reborn as Draupadi, and they were thus destined for each other. Vyasa added that in another instance a young woman had prayed to Shiva for a husband and in her inner enthusiasm had prayed 5 times instead of once. This woman was now reborn as Draupadi and Shiva had fulfilled her prayers. Convinced by these stories, Draupadi consented to the marriage. Present-day historians suggest that the fact that the authors described a polyandrous union indicates that polyandry may have been prevalent amongst ruling elites at some point of time. At the same time, the fact that so many different explanations are offered for the episode suggests that polyandry gradually fell into disfavor amongst the Brahmanas who reworked and developed the text through the centuries. Some historians note that while the practice of polyandry may have seemed unusual or even undesirable from the Brahmanical point of view, it was and is prevalent in the Himalayan region. Others suggest that there may have been a shortage of women during times of warfare, and this led to polyandry. In other words, it was attributed to a situation of crisis. Some early sources suggest that polyandry was not only or even the most prevalent form of marriage. Why then did the authors choose to associate this practice with the central characters of the Mahabharata? We need to remember that creative literature often has its own narrative requirements and does not always literally reflect social realities. A dynamic text. The growth of the Mahabharata did not stop with the Sanskrit version. Over the centuries, versions of the epics were written in a variety of languages through an ongoing process of dialogue between peoples, communities, and those who wrote the text. Several stories that originated in specific regions or circulated among certain people found their way into the epic. At the same time, the central story of the epic was often retold in different ways, and episodes were depicted in sculpture and painting. They also provided themes for a wide range of performing arts, plays, dance, and other kinds of narrations. Most retellings or reenactments of the epic draw on the main narrative in creative ways. Let us look at one example, an episode from the Mahabharata that has been transformed by Mahasweta Devi, a contemporary Bengali writer known for raising her voice form against all forms of exploitation and oppression. In this particular instance, she works out alternative possibilities from the main story of the Mahabharata and draws attention to the question on which the Sanskrit text is silent. The Sanskrit text describes how Duryodhana plotted to kill the Pandavas by inviting them to stay in a specially prepared house of lake, which he planned to set on fire. Forewarned, the Pandavas dug a tunnel to ensure their escape. Then Kunti arranged for a feast while most of the invitees were Brahmanas. A Nisada woman came with her 5 sons. When they were satiated with drink and fell off to sleep, the Pandavas escaped, setting fire to the house. When the bodies of the woman and her sons were discovered, people thought that the Pandavas were dead. In her short story titled Kunti O Nisedi, Mahasweta Devi takes out the narrative form where the Mahabharata ends it. She sets the story in a forest where Kunti retires after the war. Kunti now has time to reflect on her past and often confesses to what she regards as her failings, talking with the earth, the symbol of nature. Every day she sees the Nisadas who come to collect wood, honey, tubers, and roots. One Nisadi, a Nisada woman, often listens to Kunti when she talks with the earth. One day, there was something in the air. The animals were fleeing the forest. Kunti noticed that the Nisidi was watching her and was startled when she spoke to her and asked if she remembered the house of lake. Yes, Kunti said. She did. Did she remember a certain elderly Nisidi and her 5 young sons, and that she had served them wine till they were senseless? While she escaped with her own sons, that Nisidi, not you, Kunti exclaimed. The Nisidi replied that the woman who was killed had been her mother-in-law. She added that while Kunti had been reflecting on her past, not once did she remember the 6 innocent lives that were lost because she had wanted to save herself and her sons. As they spoke, the flames drew nearer. The Nisidi escaped to safety, but Kunti remained where she was. तो ये है टाइमलाइन 1 जिसमें मेजर टेक्सचुअल ट्रेडिशन के बारे में है, और ये है टाइमलाइन 2 जिसमें मेजर लैंडमार्क्स इन द स्टडी ऑफ महाभारत दिखाया गया है। और ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज, और इसी के साथ हमारा आज का चैप्टर ख़त्म होता है। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।